In the beginning, the tragedy of Iharnam was not born of malice, but of a desperate and misguided ambition to transcend the limitations of the human form. This was a story of scholars and priests who looked into the dark and mistook the abyss for salvation. At the heart of this collapse stood the Healing Church, an institution founded on the discovery of the old blood within the labyrinthine tombs of the Pithumerians. While the common folk of the city saw the blood as a miracle cure for every ailment, the architects of the church, men like Lawrence and Ludwig, knew that the blood carried a heavy price. It brought with it a beastly scourge, a transformation that turned the citizens into snarling monstrosities. To manage this escalating horror, the church established the Hunters, a group of specialized warriors tasked with cleansing the streets in secret. Among these early pioneers was Ludwig, the first hunter of the Healing Church, a man of immense conviction who sought to give the people of Iharnam a sense of nobility and purpose, even as their world began to rot from within. Ludwig was a hero of a different era, a man who believed in chivalry and the righteous nature of his cause. Unlike the workshops of the past that operated in the shadows, Ludwig's hunt was a public affair, a grand effort to recruit the citizens themselves into the struggle against the beasts. He founded a new line of hunters, the Holy Blades, who modeled themselves after the knights of old. To lead them, Ludwig brandished a weapon that seemed to defy the grim reality of the city, the Holy Moonlight Sword. This was a massive blade that hummed with an arcane, celestial power, discovered deep within the Chalice dungeons. Ludwig claimed to find guidance in the sword, seeing a thin thread of light even in the darkest moments of the hunt. He closed his eyes to the blood and the screaming, focusing instead on the dancing spirits of light that only he could see. But the moonlight was a fickle mentor. As the scourge worsened and the beasts grew larger and more grotesque, the pressure on Ludwig's soul became unbearable. The very blood he spilled in the name of the church began to saturate his mind, and the line between the hunter and the beast started to dissolve. The true origin of the curse, however, lay far from the cobblestone streets of Iharnam, in a secluded and forgotten place known as the Fishing Hamlet. It was here that the original sin of the hunters was committed, a crime so heinous that it birthed a nightmare that would haunt the Order for eternity. Long ago, the scholars of Biogenworth, led by Jayaman and supported by the early hunters, descended upon this peaceful village after the carcass of a great one named Kas washed up on the shore. Driven by a thirst for eldritch knowledge, the hunters committed a massacre, slaughtering the villagers and violating the corpse of the Great One to harvest its secrets. They sought the umbilical cords and the inner eyes that would grant them godhood, showing no mercy to the life they found there. The wrath of the dying Kas and the suffering of the hamlet's inhabitants coalesced into a curse, a metaphysical trap designed to claim anyone who brandished the title of hunter. This was the birth of the hunter's nightmare, a realm of eternal torment where those drunk with blood were dragged once they had lost their humanity. The hunter's nightmare is a distorted reflection of Iharnam, a place where the geography of the city is twisted and melted, submerged in a sea of blood and mud. It is a world where the sun is a pale, sickly eye, and the sky is a nebula of gore. In this realm, the hunters of old are trapped in a cycle of endless violence, unable to die and unable to stop the slaughter. They roam the familiar cathedrals and plazas, but their minds are gone, replaced by a singular, obsessive drive to kill. They no longer distinguish between man and beast, seeing everything as prey to be carved apart. Among these wretches, the most tragic figure is Ludwig himself, the man who once stood as the beacon of the healing church was dragged into the nightmare as he finally succumbed to the scourge. He did not become a simple werewolf. He was transformed into a towering, equine monstrosity, a mass of malformed limbs and weeping eyes known as Ludwig the Accursed. He lost his sword, his guidance, and his name, left to wallow in a literal mountain of corpses at the base of the nightmare's grand cathedral. As the protagonist of this story, the player is drawn into this nightmare through the eye of a blood-drunk hunter, a macabre relic that serves as a key to the curse. Upon entering the nightmare, the hero is greeted by a sight of absolute desolation. The city they once knew is unrecognizable, leaning at impossible angles and overflowing with a liquid that looks and smells like ancient, stagnant blood. The first area of the nightmare is a gauntlet of the past, where the old hunters, men wearing the archaic garb of the early workshops, patrol the paths with whips and curved swords. These are the ancestors of the current hunt, and they are terrifying in their speed and aggression. They are the living embodiment of what happens when a hunter lives too long and drinks too deep. To move forward is to witness the physical manifestation of the church's failure, as the very people meant to protect the city are now the primary threat to any living soul who dares to enter their domain. The journey through the nightmare's opening stages leads the hero toward the grand cathedral. But this is not the place of worship found in the waking world. It is a fortress of secrets. Along the way, the hero encounters Simon the Harrowed, one of the few hunters who has managed to keep his sanity within the dream. Simon speaks in riddles and warnings, revealing that the nightmare is a lid on a deep, dark secret that the healing church has tried to bury forever. He explains that to find the truth, one must look beyond the beasts and the blood, toward the source of the curse itself. This path is blocked by the mountain of corpses where Ludwig waits, a fallen idol who has become a parody of the chivalry he once championed. The air here is thick with the buzzing of flies and the stench of rot, and the only sound is the rhythmic, wet thud of the monster's movements. Battle with Ludwig is a twofold experience of horror and redemption. In his first form, he is a mindless animal, charging and flailing with a desperation that speaks of total madness. He is a creature of pure instinct, a nightmare of horseflesh and human limbs. But as the fight reaches its peak and the monster is brought to his knees, he catches a glimpse of his old blade, the holy moonlight sword, which has been buried beneath the pile of bodies. At the sight of the moonlight, a flicker of the man returns. He stands upright, clutching the sword with a shaking hand, and for a brief moment, the accursed beast becomes the holy blade once more. He fights with a renewed grace, wielding the celestial energy of the sword to defend his honor. When he finally falls, he asks the hero if his hunters stayed true to the path of light. The choice to tell him the truth or to grant him a merciful lie is the final act of a tragedy that began with a simple desire to save a city from the dark. This is the beginning of the end for the secrets of the church. With Ludwig defeated, the way is opened to the research hall and the astral clock tower, where the deeper crimes of Lawrence and his associates are kept under lock and key. The nightmare is not just a place of punishment. It is a laboratory where the early experiments on human transcendence were carried out, leaving behind a trail of broken bodies and shattered minds. The hero realizes that the blood they have been using to survive is the very same substance that fueled these atrocities. The quest to reach the Fishing Hamlet and silence the orphan's cry is the only way to break the curse and free the hunters from their eternal prison. But to get there, they must first face the shadows of the past that still guard the clock tower. Specifically, the one woman who could never forgive herself for what she did in the name of progress. The transition from the blood-slicked corridors of the nightmare Grand Cathedral to the towering, sterile verticality of the research hall marks a shift from physical brutality to the cold, intellectual horror of the healing church's early days. This massive structure, hidden behind the shifting gears of the astral clock tower, served as the primary site for the church's most ambitious and depraved experiments. Here, the scholars did not hunt beasts, they attempted to create gods. The atmosphere inside the hall is one of suffocating clinical misery, where the sound of dripping water is often indistinguishable from the soft, rhythmic chanting of patients who have lost their sanity to the sound of the sea. The geography of the hall is a labyrinth of rickety wooden stairs and narrow balconies that spiral upward toward the ceiling, suggesting a desperate physical climb toward the heavens that the church could never reach through spiritual means. In this era of the church's history, the focus was not on the consumption of blood for its healing properties, but on the expansion of the human mind to perceive the truth of the great ones. The patients found throughout the hall are the living remnants of this endeavor. Most appear as enlarged, bulbous-headed figures wrapped in tattered bandages, their bodies fragile and their movements erratic. These individuals were subjected to the forced ingestion of fluid and the implantation of brain fluid to induce a state of cosmic awareness. They were told they would hear the whispers of the gods, but instead, they were left with a deafening, internal resonance that drove them to plead for the sound of water to drown out the noise. The hero realizes that these were not just random victims, but the faithful who believed in the church's promise of evolution. Their suffering is a testament to the belief that human flesh was merely a husk to be discarded or reshaped in the pursuit of eldritch wisdom. At the center of this vertical nightmare is the lift mechanism, a system of gears and pulleys that the hero must manipulate to reach the higher floors. As the protagonist ascends, the nature of the experiments becomes increasingly clear and increasingly grotesque. In the lower levels, the patients are mostly passive, huddled in corners and clutching their heads. But as the hero reaches the mid-levels, they encounter those who have developed a violent, frantic energy. Some wield IV stands as makeshift clubs, while others crawl along the floors, their oversized heads dragging behind them like a heavy burden. The air is thick with the scent of chemicals and the metallic tang of old blood, and the walls are lined with jars containing the failed results of previous attempts to harvest brain fluid. The hero understands that this was a factory of the soul, where the individual was reduced to a data point in a grand, failed equation. Among the patients, the most poignant figure is Adeline, a woman who remains tied to a chair, her mind still clinging to a shred of lucidity despite the massive growth of her head. Adeline represents the tragic devotion of the church's followers. She asks the hero to bring her brain fluid, believing that she is on the verge of a breakthrough, that she will soon become a vessel for the voice of the cosmos. By fulfilling her requests, the hero witnesses the final stages of her transformation. She eventually collapses into a state where her physical body is almost entirely eclipsed by the burgeoning mass of her brain. Her death is not a release from the nightmare, but the final step in a process that stripped her of everything she once was. The hero is left holding a rune that hums with the sound of the ocean, a small, cold comfort for the life that was extinguished to produce it. The climb toward the top of the hall eventually leads to a balcony overlooking a massive, overgrown garden of luminous, celestial flowers. This is the living failures domain, a collection of beings who represent the church's closest, yet most disappointing, attempt at creating a great one. These towering, blue-skinned humanoids possess immense physical strength and the ability to call down meteors from the cosmos, yet they lack the spark of true divinity. They are mindless, protective, and ultimately hollow. The battle against them is a chaotic struggle against a swarm of failed potential. The atmosphere is one of overwhelming blue light and thunderous arcane energy, as the hero dodges celestial projectiles while cutting down these lumbering husks. The victory over the failures is a bitter one. It proves that for all the lives lost in the research hall, the church produced nothing but a mockery of the beings they sought to emulate. Beyond the garden lies the threshold of the astral clock tower, the personal sanctum of Lady Maria. Maria was one of the first hunters, a student of Jayaman and a distant relative of the Canehurst royalty. Unlike the other hunters who became drunk with blood, Maria was haunted by the crimes she committed at the Fishing Hamlet. She discarded her beloved weapon, the rakuyo, throwing it into a well in the hamlet in a fit of remorse, and dedicated her life to caring for the patients of the research hall. She became a mother figure to the broken and the lost, providing them with the only comfort they knew in a world of clinical torture. Yet, her presence in the clock tower is not one of peace, but of guardianship. She sits in a high-backed chair, appearing dead at first, her throat slit in an act of apparent suicide. She is the final lock on the secret that the church needs to keep buried. When the hero approaches the dial of the clock tower, Maria awakens, her movements fluid and lethal. The battle with Lady Maria is a dance of blood and steel, a confrontation with a warrior who has mastered the art of the hunt without ever losing her terrifying elegance. As the fight progresses, she begins to use her own blood to enhance her strikes, a technique that recalls her Canehurst heritage and shows the depth of her desperation. She does not fight for glory or for the church. She fights to prevent the hero from witnessing the atrocity that lies beyond the clock. The atmosphere in the tower is one of tragic intimacy, the sun filtering through the massive gears as the hero trades blows with a woman who is the last honorable remnant of a dishonorable order. Her fall marks the end of the church's protection over the nightmare, as the clock face slides open to reveal the path to the fishing hamlet. Standing on the balcony of the clock tower after Maria's defeat, the hero looks out over a view that should be impossible. Below them lies the sea, and nestled within the gray, foggy cliffs is the fishing hamlet. The transition from the clinical towers of the city to the salt-crusted ruins of the village is a descent into the heart of the curse. The hero realizes that the entire research hall and the clock tower were merely barriers, built to distance the church from the sin that started it all. They carry the weight of the patient's screams and Maria's silent sacrifice as they prepare to walk into the village where the great One Cos once washed ashore. The focus would now shift to the gray, rain-slicked streets of the hamlet, where the fishmen wait with harpoons, and the ghost of an unborn god cries out from the womb of its dead mother, demanding a reckoning for the hunters who took everything from them. The final realization for the hero as they step into the hamlet is that the nightmare is not just a place, but a living memory of guilt. Every patient in the hall, every hunter drunk on blood, and every monster in the cathedral is a direct result of the events that took place in this small, damp corner of the world. The church tried to evolve through blood and brain fluid, but they only succeeded in anchoring themselves to a moment of primal violence. The air in the hamlet is heavy with the smell of brine and death, and the sky is dominated by the massive, pale form of the moon, which seems to watch with a cold, uncaring eye. The protagonist is no longer just a hunter. They are a witness to the end of an era, a figure who must walk through the remains of a broken pact to find the only thing that can truly end the cycle of the dream. A final, merciful death for the orphan who was never allowed to live. The descent from the shattered dial of the astral clock tower into the sodden, gray expanse of the fishing hamlet marks the final transition from the gilded lies of the healing church to the raw, pulsating heart of their original sin. This is a place where the air is thick with the suffocating scent of brine and ancient rot, and the sky is a heavy shroud of mist that hides the true scale of the coastal devastation. The geography of the hamlet is a treacherous labyrinth of rickety wooden piers, barnacle-encrusted shacks, and deep, lightless tide pools that seem to swallow the very light of the pale moon. Here, the architecture of Iharnam is replaced by a primitive, salt-blasted ruin, suggesting a time before the church, before the blood, and before the dream itself. The hero realizes that they have stepped out of the curated nightmare of the city and into a primal memory of a massacre that the world was never meant to remember. The inhabitants of the hamlet are the fishmen, the mutated remnants of the original villagers who were transformed by their proximity to the Great One Cos. They are pathetic, spindly creatures with elongated limbs and translucent skin, yet they possess a frantic, vengeful strength. They wield harpoons and rusted cleavers with the desperation of a people who have already lost everything. Among them are the massive shark giants, bloated monstrosities that lurk in the dark corners of the village. Their presence, a physical manifestation of the violent evolutionary surge that gripped the hamlet after the scholars arrived. These creatures do not hunt for sport. They guard the path to the coast with a territorial ferocity that suggests they are protecting the sanctity of a grave. The hero understands that these beings are the living evidence of the hunters' cruelty, a race of people whose very biology was rewritten by the trauma of a divine intervention they never asked for. As the protagonist moves deeper into the village, the voice of the nightmare begins to take a specific, audible form. It is the sound of a rhythmic, echoing bell, rung by the village priests who call down the wrath of the sea upon any intruder. The atmosphere becomes one of liturgical dread. The hero finds the bodies of villagers tied to poles, their skulls opened to reveal the absence of eyes, a direct reference to the Biogenworth scholar's obsession with internal sight. This was the site of a systematic harvest, where Jayaman and his contemporaries sifted through the brains of the innocent to find the secrets of the cosmos. The hero realizes that the insight the church so highly prized was bought with the literal pieces of a peaceful community. Every step through the knee-deep water is a reminder that the hunters were once nothing more than butchers, and the miracle of the old blood was a nectar refined from a site of unparalleled slaughter. The journey leads to the center of the village, where a well sits in a small plaza, its depths hiding the discarded weapon of Lady Maria. By descending into this dark hole, the hero finds the rakuyo, the blade that Maria could no longer bear to hold after she saw what her peers were doing to the pregnant villagers. The presence of the sword in the muck is a silent confession of the guilt that drove her to the clock tower. But the well is also home to the shark giants, who fight with a relentless, crushing power. The hero must overcome these shadows of the past to claim the weapon, realizing that even the most graceful of hunters left a trail of filth behind them. The struggle in the well is a microcosm of the entire nightmare, a desperate fight for a relic of honor buried in a pit of evolutionary sludge. Beyond the village lies a series of dark, damp caverns that lead toward the shore. These caves are filled with the slugs of the cosmos, small, glowing entities that represent the earliest forms of eldritch life. The walls are lined with the calcified remains of those who tried to ascend, their bodies frozen in a state of mid-transformation. The air here is cold and still, a sharp contrast to the chaotic violence of the village above. This is the womb of the nightmare, the place where the physical and the metaphysical are most tightly entwined. The hero encounters the shade of Simon, the harrowed, one last time, finding him slumped against a wall, mortally wounded. With his final breath, Simon begs the hero to put an end to the nightmare by silencing the source of the curse. He reveals that the only way to heal the world is to face the truth that lies at the very edge of the ocean, where the body of Kos still rests in the surf. The emergence onto the coast of Kos is a moment of stark, monochromatic beauty. The beach is a vast stretch of gray sand and white foam, dominated by the colossal, pale carcass of the Great One. Kos appears as a massive mammalian entity, her skin like marble, and her presence radiating a profound, lingering sadness. This is the mother whose death birthed the nightmare, and her body has become a shrine for the lost souls of the village. As the hero approaches the corpse, a dark shadow emerges from her womb, a tall, emaciated figure with a translucent cape and a weapon made of a jagged, lunar placenta. This is the orphan of Kos, the Great One who was never born into the physical world, yet exists here as a sentient manifestation of the hamlet's collective rage. The orphan stands over his mother's body, staring up at the pale moon and crying out with a voice that sounds like a human child's scream, filtered through 1,000 years of salt and wind. The battle against the orphan of Kos is the most intense confrontation in the history of the hunt. The orphan moves with an erratic, frenetic speed, leaping across the beach and swinging his weapon in wide, punishing arcs. He possesses the raw power of a god, but the temperament of a cornered animal. In the first phase of the fight, he is a creature of sorrow, his movements heavy with the weight of his unlived life. But as the hero draws blood, the orphan's rage reaches a boiling point. He calls down bolts of lightning from the sea and grows spectral wings of shadow, his cries becoming a deafening roar that shakes the very foundations of the nightmare. This is not a duel of honor or a hunt for a beast. It is a desperate struggle against the physical embodiment of a curse. The hero realizes that the orphan is fighting for the right to exist in the only world he has ever known, a world of pain and memories. When the orphan finally falls, his body dissolves into a thin, dark mist that clings to the carcass of his mother. The hero is left standing in the surf, the silence of the beach more heavy than the battle that preceded it. By striking the small, black spirit that lingers over Kos, the hero finally silences the nightmare. A cinematic vision follows, showing the spirit ascending into the clouds as a voice whispers about the sweet child of Kos finally being returned to the ocean. The curse is lifted, not through the destruction of the hamlet, but through the acknowledgement of the sin. The hero realizes that the old hunters were not just victims of their own bloodlust, but prisoners of a secret they could never outrun. The nightmare fades into a dull, lingering ache, a historical record of a time when men tried to be gods and left only ghosts in their wake. The experience ends with the hero returning to the waking world, the eye of a blood-drunk hunter, now a cold and inert stone. They carry the rakuyo and the parasite of Kas as trophies of a journey into the deepest recesses of human depravity. The research hall and the astral clock tower are now just memories of a failed verticality, and the fishing hamlet remains a gray, distant thought. Hero understands that the healing church's power was built on a foundation of sand and blood, and that the true cost of their ascension was the soul of an entire village. The focus would now shift back to the streets of Iharnam, where the moon still hangs low and the hunt continues. But the hero now knows the truth. The beasts they fight are merely the shadows cast by the hunters who came before them, and the nightmare will only truly end when the last drop of the old blood has been washed away by the tide of time. Discovery of the eye of a blood-drunk hunter in the pocket of a dead man in the cathedral ward marks the transition from the tangible, decaying city of Iharnam into the metaphysical purgatory of those who succumbed to the hunt. This experience is defined by the shattering of temporal reality, as the protagonist is snatched by the invisible hand of an amygdala and cast into a world where the architecture of the city has been liquefied and resolidified by the collective guilt of the healing church. The atmosphere shifted from the damp cobblestones of the waking world to a sun-drenched, gore-soaked delirium. To walk through the hunter's nightmare was to realize that the sacred mission of the church was merely a cover for an ancient atrocity. The hero understood that this realm was not a physical place, but a psychic reservoir for every drop of blood ever spilled in the name of progress, holding the hunters in an eternal loop of the very slaughter they once championed. The encounter with the old hunters was a story of ancestral bloodlust. In the twisted plazas of this dream city, the hero met the warriors of the first workshop, men who wore the top hats and scapulars of an era long since forgotten by the citizens of Iharnam. This was the era of the blood-drunk executioner, where the atmosphere was one of erratic, ancient violence. These hunters did not fight with the calculated precision of the modern hunt. They swung heavy curved swords and cracked whips with a manic, joyless ferocity. The hero realized that these were the fathers of the hunt, men who had looked into the eyes of the beast for so long that they had adopted the beast's own rhythm. The world around them was a screaming gallery of history, where the very ground was made of the compacted bones of the prey, and the sun hung in the sky like a pale, blind eye that refused to blink. The ascent to the cathedral of the nightmare was a moment of fallen chivalry. At the end of a river of blood, the hero encountered Ludwig the Accursed, the man who had once been the holy blade of the healing church. This part of the history is a story of the total erosion of the human image, as the protagonist faced a creature that was a harrowing fusion of horse and man. Its body, a mass of weeping eyes and vestigial limbs. The atmosphere was one of deep, visceral repulsion as the monster flailed in a pit of corpses. However, the discovery of the holy moonlight sword triggered a moment of lucid redemption. For a brief instant, the beast remembered the guidance of the light, standing tall to fight with the elegance of a knight. The hero realized that even in the deepest pits of the nightmare, a fragment of the soul could remain, clinging to a memory of honor that the blood could not entirely erase. Infiltration of the research hall was a story of clinical dehumanization. Beyond the cathedral lay a towering labyrinth of verticality and madness, where the church had once attempted to ascend through intellectual torture. This was the era of the ascension of the brain fluid, where the atmosphere shifted to one of cold, damp obsession. The hero moved through floors filled with patients with bulbous, bandaged heads, individuals who had been drowned in fluid, to hear the whispers of the cosmos. The atmosphere was oppressive and static, filled with the rhythmic chanting of the damned. The protagonist realized that the miracles of the church were built on the systematic harvesting of human hope, and that every step upward toward the astral clock tower was a step over the discarded husks of those who believed the lie of the inner eye. The confrontation with Lady Maria was a moment of tragic guardianship. In the heart of the clock tower, the hero faced one of the first hunters, a woman who had discarded her pride to protect the secret of the Fishing Hamlet. This part of the history is a story of remorse armed with steel, as Maria used her own Canehurst blood to paint the air in arcs of fire. The atmosphere was one of elegant, lethal melancholy, the gears of the clock tower grinding in the background like the beating heart of the curse. The hero realized that Maria was not a villain, but a self-imposed jailer, ensuring that no one would ever witness the original sin that the church had committed. By defeating her, the hero was not just progressing, they were violating the last sanctuary of honor, left in the nightmare to reach the truth of the shore. The experience ends with the Dragonborn, now a hunter of the dream, standing on the gray, rain-slicked cliffs of the Fishing Hamlet. The shadow of the clock tower had led to a coast of calcified agony. They carried the weight of Ludwig's sword and the guilt of Maria's fall. The atmosphere was one of salty, brine-soaked reckoning, a realization that they had reached the source of the plague. The focus would now shift to the silence of the orphan, as the protagonist prepared to descend into the village of fishmen and great ones, to face the unborn god, and finally sever the cord of the nightmare that had bound the hunters for an eternity. The entry into the salt-blasted ruins of the Fishing Hamlet marks the final transition from the gilded, architectural lies of the healing church to the raw, pulsating heart of their original sin. This is a place where the air is a heavy, suffocating shroud of brine and ancient rot, and the sky is a permanent veil of gray mist that hides the true scale of the coastal devastation. The geography of the hamlet is a treacherous labyrinth of rickety wooden piers, barnacle-encrusted shacks, and deep, lightless tide pools that seem to swallow the very light of the pale moon. Here, the sophisticated stone of Iharnam is replaced by a primitive, sea-shattered ruin, suggesting a time before the church, before the blood, and before the dream itself. The hero realizes that they have stepped out of the curated nightmare of the city and into a primal memory of a massacre that the world was never meant to remember. A site where the boundaries between man, beast, and God were first violently blurred. The inhabitants of the hamlet are the fishmen, the mutated remnants of the original villagers, who were transformed by their proximity to the great One Kas after she washed ashore. They are pathetic, spindly creatures with elongated limbs and translucent skin, yet they possess a frantic, vengeful strength that belies their frail appearance. They wield harpoons and rusted cleavers with the desperation of a people who have already lost everything and are now merely vessels for a lingering, ancestral spite. Among them are the massive shark giants, bloated monstrosities that lurk in the dark corners of the village and the lightless depths of the central well. Their presence is a physical manifestation of the violent evolutionary surge that gripped the hamlet after the scholars of Biogenworth arrived. These creatures do not hunt for sport. They guard the path to the coast with a territorial ferocity that suggests they are protecting the sanctity of a mass grave. The hero understands that these beings are the living evidence of the hunters' cruelty, a race of people whose very biology was rewritten by the trauma of a divine intervention they never asked for. As the protagonist moves deeper into the village, the voice of the nightmare begins to take a specific, audible form in the rhythmic, echoing bell rung by the village priests. These figures call down the wrath of the sea, summoning bolts of lightning and swarms of spectral spirits to crush any intruder. The atmosphere becomes one of liturgical dread, a religion born of pain and the sea. The hero finds the bodies of villagers tied to poles, their skulls opened to reveal the absence of eyes, a direct reference to the Biogenworth scholar's obsession with internal sight and the harvesting of brain fluid. This was the site of a systematic harvest, where Jayaman and his contemporaries sifted through the brains of the innocent to find the secrets of the cosmos. The hero realizes that the insight the church so highly prized was bought with the literal pieces of a peaceful community. Every step through the knee-deep water is a reminder that the hunters were once nothing more than butchers, and the miracle of the old blood was a nectar refined from a site of unparalleled slaughter. The journey leads to the center of the village, where a well sits in a small, mud-slicked plaza, its depths hiding the discarded weapon of Lady Maria. By descending into this dark hole, the hero finds the Rakuyo, the twin-bladed sword that Maria could no longer bear to hold after she witnessed the atrocities committed against the villagers. The presence of the sword in the muck is a silent confession of the guilt that eventually drove her to the top of the clock tower. But the well is also home to the shark giants, who fight with a relentless, crushing power that fills the cramped space with the sound of breaking bone and splashing water. The hero must overcome these shadows of the past to claim the weapon, realizing that even the most graceful of hunters left a trail of filth behind them. The struggle in the well is a microcosm of the entire nightmare, a desperate fight for a relic of honor buried in a pit of evolutionary sludge. Beyond the village lies a series of dark, damp caverns that lead toward the open shore. These caves are filled with the slugs of the cosmos, small, glowing entities that represent the earliest forms of eldritch life, clinging to the damp stone like luminescent parasites. The walls are lined with the calcified remains of those who tried to ascend, their bodies frozen in a state of mid-transformation, reaching out for a divinity that only brought them ruin. The air here is cold and still, a sharp contrast to the chaotic violence of the village above. This is the womb of the nightmare, the place where the physical and the metaphysical are most tightly entwined. The hero encounters the shade of Simon, the harrowed, one last time, finding him slumped against a wall, mortally wounded by the very secrets he sought to uncover. With his final breath, Simon begs the hero to put an end to the nightmare by silencing the source of the curse, revealing that the only way to heal the world is to face the truth that lies at the very edge of the ocean. The emergence onto the coast of Kos is a moment of stark, monochromatic beauty that feels detached from reality. The beach is a vast stretch of gray sand and white foam, dominated by the colossal, pale carcass of the Great One. Kos appears as a massive mammalian entity, her skin like marble and her presence radiating a profound, lingering sadness that seems to weigh down the very air. This is the mother whose death birthed the nightmare, and her body has become a shrine for the lost souls of the village. As the hero approaches the corpse, a dark shadow emerges from her womb, a tall, emaciated figure with a translucent cape and a weapon made of a jagged, lunar placenta. This is the orphan of Kos, the Great One who was never born into the physical world, yet exists here as a sentient manifestation of the Hamlet's collective rage. The orphan stands over his mother's body, staring up at the pale moon and crying out with a voice that sounds like a human child's scream, filtered through 1,000 years of salt and wind. The battle against the orphan of Kos is the most intense confrontation in the history of the hunt, a struggle that transcends the simple killing of a beast. The orphan moves with an erratic, frenetic speed, leaping across the beach and swinging his weapon in wide, punishing arcs that kick up the gray sand and seawater. He possesses the raw power of a god, but the temperament of a cornered, grieving animal. In the first phase of the fight, he is a creature of sorrow, his movements heavy with the weight of his unlived life. But as the hero draws blood, the orphan's rage reaches a boiling point. He calls down bolts of lightning from the sea and grows spectral wings of shadow, his cries becoming a deafening roar that shakes the very foundations of the nightmare. This is not a duel of honor. It is a desperate struggle against the physical embodiment of a curse. The hero realizes that the orphan is fighting for the right to exist in the only world he has ever known, a world of pain and memories. When the orphan finally falls, his body dissolves into a thin, dark mist that clings to the carcass of his mother. The hero is left standing in the surf, the silence of the beach more heavy than the battle that preceded it. By striking the small, black spirit that lingers over the body of Kos, the hero finally silences the nightmare. A cinematic vision follows, showing the spirit ascending into the clouds as a voice whispers about the sweet child of Kos finally being returned to the ocean. The curse is lifted, not through the destruction of the hamlet, but through the acknowledgement of the sin. The hero realizes that the old hunters were not just victims of their own bloodlust, but prisoners of a secret they could never outrun. The nightmare fades into a dull, lingering ache, a historical record of a time when men tried to be gods and left only ghosts in their wake. The hero understands that the healing church's power was built on a foundation of sand and blood, and that the true cost of their ascension was the soul of an entire village. The return to the grand cathedral within the depths of the nightmare marks a transition from the salt-crusted tragedy of the coast to the primordial fire of the healing church's founding. While the orphan of Kos represented the sin of the scholars, the figure resting upon the altar of the nightmare cathedral represents the vanity of the priesthood. This structure is a distorted mirror of the cathedral in the waking world. But here the air does not smell of incense and prayer. It reeks of scorched fur and ancient, cauterized meat. The architecture is draped in heavy, dark cloths that seem to pulse with a hidden heat, and the floor is littered with the skulls of those who sought healing and found only the flame. At the center of this sanctum lies the cleric beast, or what remains of it, clutching a skull that hums with a faint, rhythmic heat. This is Lawrence, the first vicar, the man who defied his master Willem to bring the old blood to Iharnam, and who, in doing so, ignited the fuse that would eventually consume the entire city. The history of Lawrence is a story of a schism born from the desire for immediate evolution. Long ago, Lawrence was a student at Biogenworth, a bright and ambitious scholar who grew frustrated with Willem's cautious mantra to fear the old blood. Lawrence believed that the blood was the key to human transcendence, a shortcut to the divine that could be mastered through faith and ritual. He left the college, taking the blood with him, and founding the healing church, promising the people of Iharnam a new era of health and prosperity. This was the era of the great beginning, where the atmosphere was one of misplaced hope and religious fervor. Lawrence was the architect of the dream, the man who turned a medical discovery into a theological empire. But the blood carried the beastly scourge, and Lawrence was destined to become the very thing he sought to cure. He became the first of the church's high-ranking clergy to transform, his beastly form being so massive and terrifying that it set the standard for the horrors that would follow. The confrontation with Lawrence begins only after the hero retrieves his human skull from the lift of the research hall and brings it back to the altar. As the hero approaches, the beast awakens, its body erupting into a violent, inextinguishable flame. This experience is defined by the heat of the first sin, as the atmosphere shifts from the cold gloom of the cathedral to a blistering, orange-hued inferno. Lawrence is a creature of lava and fur, his movements heavy and clumsy, but infused with a devastating, explosive power. Every strike of his massive claws leaves a trail of fire on the floor, and his screams are a mixture of animal rage and human agony. The hero realizes that this fire is not just a weapon. It is the physical manifestation of the fever that gripped Lawrence's mind, a burning reminder of the betrayal that started the plague. The battle is a grueling test of endurance, as the hero must navigate a battlefield that is slowly becoming a lake of molten blood. As the fight enters its final stage, the sheer intensity of the fire consumes Lawrence's lower body, causing his legs to wither and drop away. The beast does not die. Instead, it drags itself across the floor with its massive arms, spewing lava from its severed waist and its gaping maw. This is the era of the crawling remnant, where the atmosphere becomes one of desperate, grinding survival. The hero watches as the founder of the church is reduced to a half-formed mass of burning sludge, still lashing out with a blind, senseless fury. The hero understands that this is the ultimate fate of those who sought to master the blood, a state of permanent, agonizing incompleteness. Lawrence is no longer a man, a god, or even a proper beast. He is a living wound in the fabric of the nightmare, a fire that cannot go out because the guilt that fuels it is infinite. By extinguishing this flame, the hero is not just killing a monster. They are performing a late, necessary mercy for the man who broke the world. The death of Lawrence provides the hero with the beast's embrace, a rune that allows a hunter to tap into the very scourge that the first vicar unleashed. This is the acquisition of the inner beast, a realization that the only way to survive the nightmare is to acknowledge the monster within. The hero carries the weight of Lawrence's skull and the memory of his burning screams, understanding that the healing church was a house of cards built upon a foundation of volatile blood. The atmosphere of the cathedral cools into a gray, ashen silence, the fire finally spent. The protagonist looks at the altar and realizes that the line between the holy and the profane was never real. It was a distinction made by men like Lawrence to justify their own curiosity. The focus would now shift to the deeper layers of the nightmare, toward the figures who existed in the periphery of the church's rise, such as the Gatling gun-wielding Jura and the hunters who chose to abandon the dream for a more honest form of existence. The hero's journey through the Old Hunters DLC reaches a state of quiet, historical reflection. They have seen the origin of the hunt in the Fishing Hamlet, the clinical depravity of the research hall, the tragic honor of Lady Maria, and the fiery end of the church's founder. Each encounter has been a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled, reveals a picture of absolute human failure. The nightmare was a prison created by the Great Ones to hold the hunters accountable for their crimes, but it also became a museum of their ambitions. The protagonist realizes that they are the first hunter to walk these paths and remain unchanged. Or perhaps they have simply become the ultimate hunter, capable of absorbing the sins of the past without succumbing to the blood drunkenness that claimed their predecessors. The air in the nightmare feels thinner now, the cycle of the curse losing its grip as the primary actors of the tragedy are laid to rest. The experience ends with the hero standing at the entrance of the hunter's dream, the sky shifting from the pale eye of the nightmare back to the familiar, orange glow of the workshop. The fiery remains of the vicar have led to a clarity of the scourge. They carry the weapons of the old world, the beast cutter, the boom hammer, and the whirligig-saw tools of a cruder, more violent age that have found a new home in the hands of the modern hunter. The atmosphere is one of exhausted completion, a realization that the secrets of the church are no longer secret. The protagonist looks at the silent, sleeping Jayaman and wonders if the old man knows that the nightmare has been silenced, or if he is still trapped in a dream of his own making. The focus would now shift to the final stages of the hunt in the waking world, as the hero prepares to face the wet nurse and the presence that looms behind the veil of the moon. Armed with the terrible knowledge of what it truly means to be a hunter of Iharnam, the final legacy of the old hunters is a reminder that the past is never truly buried in a world built on the consumption of memory and blood. The fishing hamlet still sits at the bottom of the sea, and the research hall still towers over the city, even if they only exist in the mind of a dying god. The hero has walked through the fire and the brine, and they have emerged with a soul that is heavier, but perhaps more honest. They understand that the hunt is a cycle of hunger and regret, and that the only true escape is to transcend the dream entirely. As the hunter sharpens their blade one last time, the echoes of the nightmare linger like the sound of a distant bell, a warning to those who would follow in the footsteps of Lawrence and Willem, that the pursuit of the divine always ends in the mud, and that the only thing waiting at the end of the search for truth is a screaming child on a gray, empty beach. The transition from the silenced echoes of the old hunters' nightmare back into the waking world of Iharnam marks a return to a city that has finally reached its breaking point. While the secrets of the fishing hamlet and the research hall have been laid to rest, the physical reality of the hunt has escalated into the mensis ritual, a grand and terrifying attempt by the school of Mikolash to beckon the moon and contact the Great Ones. This experience is defined by the descent into the nightmare of Mensis, a realm that feels less like a memory of guilt and more like a fever dream of pure, unadulterated madness. The geography of this place is a jagged, gravity-defying fortress of dark stone and twisted iron perched atop a mountain of petrified corpses. The atmosphere shifted from the brine-soaked tragedy of the coast to a suffocating, brain-fevered intensity. To enter the nightmare of Mensis was to realize that the healing church's internal schisms had birthed something far worse than a beastly scourge. They had birthed a cult that sought to bypass the human soul entirely in favor of a cold, cosmic void. The approach to the castle of Mensis is a gauntlet of psychic trauma, where the very light of the moon has been weaponized into a frenzy-inducing glare. High in the towers of the castle sits the brain of Mensis, a massive, rotting clump of eyes and vestigial limbs that radiates a malevolent aura. This was the result of the scholars' attempt to create a great one through collective consciousness, a project that succeeded only in creating a living source of madness. The atmosphere is one of constant, pulsing dread, as the hero must dart between shadows to avoid the gaze of the brain. The ground is littered with the bodies of those who couldn't handle the revelation, their heads having exploded from the sheer pressure of the eldritch truth. The protagonist realizes that this is the logical conclusion of Willem's pursuit of eyes, a state where to see is to suffer, and to know is to die. The hunt has moved beyond the streets and into the very neurons of the human mind, a war of perception where the enemy is the light itself. Inside the halls of the castle, the hero encounters the twisted remnants of Mikolash's followers, including the manspiders and the silver ladies who guard the dark corridors. This is the era of the fractured mind, where the atmosphere becomes one of surreal, nonsensical, labyrinthine logic. The geography of the castle shifts and loops, leading the hero into the presence of Mikolash, host of the nightmare. Mikolash is a man who has completely surrendered his sanity to the dream, running through the halls with a cage on his head and giggling to himself about the secrets of Kos. The confrontation is not a traditional duel, but a frantic, frustrating chase through a series of shifting rooms. Mikolash represents the vanity of the scholar who believes he is in control of the nightmare, even as his own mind is being eaten away by the void. The hero realizes that the host is merely a prisoner of his own delusions, a man who would rather rule a kingdom of ghosts than face the reality of the dying world outside. The defeat of Mikolash allows the hero to ascend to the highest reaches of the nightmare, toward the Murgo's loft. This area is a desolate, windswept plateau of dark stone, where the architecture seems to reach out toward the massive, pale moon that dominates the sky. The atmosphere is one of eerie, high-altitude silence, broken only by the distant, rhythmic crying of a baby. This is Murgo, the infant Great One and the source of the nightmare's power. The hero encounters the shadows of Iharnam once more, acting as silent sentinels for the unseen royalty that dwells within the loft. The hero understands that they are no longer fighting for the church or the city. They are fighting to silence a cosmic frequency that is tearing the world apart. The sky here is a deep, bruised purple, and the air feels thin and cold, as if the nightmare has finally transcended the atmosphere of the earth and entered the vacuum of the stars. At the apex of the loft, the hero encounters Queen Iharnam, the ancient Pithumerian monarch whose blood was the source of the church's original miracle. She stands in a white, blood-stained dress, pointing toward the center of the terrace, where a carriage of shadow and silence waits. This leads to the confrontation with Murgo's wet nurse, a terrifying, multi-armed entity of black silk and sharpened blades. The wet nurse is a great one tasked with protecting the unseen child, and she fights with a cold, mechanical efficiency. She can shroud the entire arena in a thick, purple fog, creating copies of herself to strike from the dark. The battle is a story of the silent protector, where the atmosphere becomes one of suffocating, lethal grace. The hero realizes that the wet nurse is not a beast. She is a celestial caretaker, a manifestation of the Great One's own parental instincts, however warped and alien they may be. The death of the wet nurse brings a sudden, jarring end to the crying of the infant. A message appears across the sky: nightmare slain. The hero is left standing on the empty terrace, the fog lifting to reveal a world that has finally gone quiet. The menses ritual has been broken, and the beckoning of the moon has reached its conclusion. The hero carries the weight of the umbilical cord and the realization that they have just ended the life of a god's child to save a world that is already beyond saving. The atmosphere is one of profound, hollow exhaustion, a feeling that the victory is a Pyrrhic one. The focus would now shift back to the hunter's dream, where the workshop is now engulfed in flames, and Jayaman waits beneath the great tree to offer the hero a final choice. The return to the hunter's dream marks the beginning of the end of the long night. The sky is no longer a soft orange, but a burning, apocalyptic red, and the doll kneels in prayer for the soul of the hunter. The protagonist realizes that the dream was never a sanctuary. It was a holding cell, a mechanism created by the moon presence to harvest the power of the hunters. Jayaman, the first hunter, sits in his wheelchair in the garden, looking tired and old. He offers the hero a merciful end, to die in the dream and awaken to the sunrise, forgetting everything that has happened. This is the era of the final release, where the atmosphere is one of melancholy resignation. The hero must decide if they are willing to return to the world of men and leave the nightmare behind, or if they have seen too much to ever truly wake up. The experience ends with the hero approaching the gate at the foot of the tree, where the flowers of the dream are white and still. The nightmare of Mensis had led to a sovereignty of the moon. They carry the memories of the Fishing Hamlet, the blood of the church, and the silence of the Great One's child. The atmosphere is one of imminent, decisive finality, a realization that the hunt is over, but the consequence of the blood remains. The hero looks at the sun beginning to rise over the horizon of the dream and understands that whether they wake up or stay, the world of Iharnam has been changed forever. by their hand. The focus would now shift to the ultimate confrontation beneath the pale moon, as the hero prepares to face the first hunter and the true master of the dream in a final struggle for the future of humanity. This movement concludes the primary cycle of the Mensis ritual and brings the protagonist to the threshold of the finale. The hunt has been completed, the nightmare silenced, and the true cost of the blood has been weighed. The hero stands at the edge of the dream, where the boundary between the mortal and the divine has become a thin, transparent line, ready to find out what lies beyond the sunrise or beneath the moon. The approach to the ancient tree at the heart of the hunter's dream marks the transition from the frantic, blood-slicked chaos of the nightmare of Mensis to a state of profound, quiet finality. While the city of Iharnam lies in ruins, consumed by the pale-blood sky and the screaming of eldritch gods, the dream remains a pocket of eerie, floral stillness. The workshop, once a place of safety and preparation, is now a pyre of orange flames, its timbers groaning as the history of the hunt begins to burn away. This experience is defined by the offering of mercy, as the protagonist walks through the waist-high white flowers to find Jayaman waiting beneath the gnarled branches of the great tree. The atmosphere shifted from the sensory overload of the cosmic void to a heavy, funereal grace. To stand before the first hunter was to realize that the entire journey was a cycle of captivity disguised as purpose, and that the man who taught the world how to kill was himself the most pitiable prisoner of all. Jayaman, the first hunter, no longer sits in his wheelchair as a frail observer. He stands as a legend reclaimed by the necessity of the end. This is a story of the burden of the shepherd, where the man who once served the scholars of Biogenworth and committed the original sin at the Fishing Hamlet has spent an eternity acting as a surrogate father for those destined to be sacrificed. The atmosphere is one of resigned, lethal duty. Jayaman offers a simple choice: to submit to his blade and wake up beneath a real sun, liberated from the memory of the nightmare, or to refuse and remain trapped in the dream forever. The hero realizes that Jayaman's offer is a true act of compassion. He wishes to spare the protagonist the eternal stagnation that has claimed his own soul. However, for a hero who has seen the truth of the great ones and the blood, the idea of ignorant peace is no longer an option. By refusing the mercy of the blade, the hero forces a confrontation that is less a battle and more a symphony of shared grief. The duel with Jayaman is a masterpiece of fluid, spectral violence. The first hunter wields the burial blade, a curved scythe of sidereal siderite that whistles through the air with a chilling, mechanical precision. This was the era of the first workshop, where the atmosphere becomes one of nostalgic, deadly elegance. Jayaman moves with a speed that defies his aged appearance, his cape fluttering like the wings of a moth as he leaps through the white petals. The battle is a story of the old guard versus the new, as the hero uses the tools refined by the church and the powder kegs to strike at the man who invented the very concept of the trick weapon. The hero realizes that Jayaman is not fighting to win, but to protect the protagonist from the moon, acting as a final barrier to prevent another soul from being consumed by the true master of the dream. His movements are a liturgy of the hunt, a final lesson from a teacher who has nothing left to give but his own death. As Jayaman falls, the nightmare of the dream reaches its zenith. The clouds part to reveal the pale, blood-red moon, and from its depths descends the moon presence, the flora of the moon, the nameless great one that conceived the hunter's dream. This part of the history is a story of the absolute parasite, as the atmosphere shifts from the floral garden to a chilling, cosmic predation. The moon presence is a creature of tentacles and exposed bone, its form a terrifying deviation from the mammalian or aquatic great ones seen before. It does not speak or roar. It radiates a paralyzing authority that seeks to dominate the hero's mind. The atmosphere is malignant and primordial, as the hero realizes that Jayaman was merely the warden's assistant, and that the true source of the hunt's longevity was this celestial entity's hunger for the blood of its peers. The hero is no longer a hunter. They are a threat to the divine order, a mortal who has consumed enough umbilical cords to resist the god's embrace. The battle against the moon presence is a moment of metaphysical defiance. Having consumed the 3 fragments of the 3rd umbilical cord, the hero possesses the internal eyes necessary to stand their ground against the god's psychic assault. This is the era of the ascension of the mortal, where the atmosphere becomes one of blinding, arcane intensity. The moon presence can reduce the hero's vitality to a single spark with a flash of light, forcing a desperate, blood-slicked rally to regain the will to fight. The hero realizes that this entity has been orchestrating the slaughter of Iharnam to eliminate other great ones, using the hunters as its vigorous claws. The struggle is a rejection of the master, a realization that the only way to truly end the cycle is to execute the architect of the dream and claim the vacancy left behind in the stars. The death of the moon presence triggers the ultimate transformation. As the god dissolves into a mist of light and shadow, the hero does not return to the waking world, nor do they die. This is a story of the childhood of humanity's next stage, as the protagonist's physical form is shed in favor of a slender, luminescent larva. The atmosphere shifts to one of quiet, infinite potential. The doll, the only constant companion throughout the night, picks up the hero's new form, whispering that they have finally achieved what Lawrence and Willem could only dream of: a true, uncorrupted ascension. The hero realizes that they are now a great one in its infancy, a being that will one day grow to reshape the very nightmare that once held them captive. The cycle of the blood and the hunt is not just stopped. It is superseded by a new evolution. The experience ends with the hero, now a stellar infant, resting in the arms of the doll as the sun finally rises over the ruins of the dream. The fire of the workshop has led to a sovereignty of the cosmos, They carry the weight of every beast slain and every secret uncovered. But those memories are now the foundation of a divine consciousness. The atmosphere is one of profound, ethereal peace, a realization that the long night has finally ended, not with a whimper or a bang, but with the birth of a new god. The focus would now shift to the silent watcher of the universe, as the hero prepares to oversee the world they once walked as a man, ensuring that the mistakes of the healing church and the scholars of Biogenworth are never repeated in the ages to come. The final legacy of the hunt is a story of the cost of transcendence. To save Iharnam, the hero had to lose their humanity, becoming the very thing the city feared most. The graveyard of the dream remains as a testament to the thousands who fell before this final victory was achieved. The hero understands that the blood was a lie, but the will to ascend was real. As the doll smiles down at the new Great One, the echoes of the hunt fade into the static of the stars, leaving behind a world that is finally free to find its own way in the dark, without the guidance of the pale moon or the hunger of the nightmare. The story of the old hunters and the dream finds its final, merciful resolution in the quiet of the morning air. The journey away from the smoke-choked spires of Iharnam and toward the frozen, isolated grandeur of Canehurst Castle marks a transition from the religious fervor of the healing church to the decadent, aristocratic ruin of an older power. To reach this place, the protagonist had to present a blood-stained summons at a lonely crossroads, boarding a phantom stagecoach that crossed a bridge of ice that no longer exists in the physical world. This experience is defined by the isolation of the forbidden, as the hero arrived at the gates of a fortress that had been excised from the history of the hunt. The atmosphere shifted from the frantic, beastly chaos of the streets to a chilling, ethereal elegance. To walk the halls of Canehurst was to realize that the church's monopoly on the blood was not a divine right, but the result of a genocidal purge. The hero understood that the vile bloods were the shadow cast by the church's own hypocrisy, a lineage born from a single drop of forbidden blood stolen from the halls of Biogenworth and used to create a court of immortal, blood-drinking nobility. The architecture of Canehurst is a story of frozen, petrified history. The grand libraries and ballrooms are filled with the spirits of long-dead handmaidens and knights who continue to perform their duties in a ghostly, automatic loop. This was the era of the sanguine aristocracy, where the atmosphere was one of haughty, blood-saturated boredom. The hero encountered the bloodlickers in the courtyard, massive, parasitic creatures that represent the literal bloat of the vile bloodline. Inside, the walls are lined with portraits of a royal family that believed they could master the corruption that the rest of the world feared. The hero realized that while Iharnam transformed into hairy beasts, Canehurst transformed into vampiric phantoms, a more refined, but no less hollow form of the scourge. The journey through the castle was a Gothic excavation, revealing a society that had turned the consumption of blood into a high art, isolating themselves behind walls of snow until the executioners of the church came to tear it all down. The rise of the executioners was a moment of self-righteous carnage. Led by martyr Logarius, this band of fanatical warriors viewed the Vilebloods not just as enemies, but as blasphemous abominations that threatened the purity of the Church's doctrine. This part of the history is a story of holy brutality, where the atmosphere becomes one of clanging iron and fanatical screams. The executioners did not use the graceful trick weapons of the hunters. They used heavy wheels of log and brass, designed to grind the immortal flesh of the nobility into a pulp. The hero realized that the conflict between the church and Cainhurst was a war of two addictions, with both sides claiming moral superiority while being equally enslaved to the power of the blood. The atmosphere was one of sanctified butchery, a realization that the church's foundation was built on the extermination of the competition. At the highest point of the castle, atop a roof slick with ice and moonlight, the hero encountered martyr Logarius himself. This was the eternal sentinel of the secret, as the protagonist faced a man who had become a living corpse to ensure the Vileblood Queen would never be free. The atmosphere was one of spectral, wintry lethality, as Logarius wielded a scythe and summoned storms of phantom blades. The hero realized that Logarius had not actually won the war. He had merely frozen the conflict in time. By donning his crown, the hero saw through the illusion and discovered the hidden throne room of Queen Annalise. The atmosphere shifted to one of ancient, defiant majesty. As the hero stood before the last of the Vilebloods, a woman who had been reduced to a meat pulp by the executioners, but could never truly die because of her corrupted blood. The interaction with Queen Annalise was a story of servitude and blood dregs. The hero was offered the chance to kneel and join the Cainhurst Covenant, becoming a hunter who sought the blood dregs found in the bodies of other hunters to offer to the queen. This was the era of the clandestine aristocrat, where the atmosphere was one of chilled, formal corruption. The hero realized that by joining her, they were siding with the outcasts of history, embracing the very blood that the church had labeled forbidden. The protagonist understood that Annalise's goal was to birth a child of blood, a new great one that would restore the glory of her line. The atmosphere was quietly monstrous, a realization that the queen was just as obsessed with transcendence through progeny as the scholars of Mensis. Only her methods were rooted in the elegance of the womb, rather than the madness of the brain. The arrival of Alfred, the last of the executioners, brought the story to a grotesque, fanatical conclusion. If the hero chose to reveal the queen's location, Alfred would descend upon the throne room with a manic, religious joy. This part of the history is a story of the horrific success of the mission, as the atmosphere became one of wet, repetitive destruction. The hero watched as Alfred, pounded the queen into a formless mass of flesh and bone, his laughter echoing through the halls as he claimed victory for his martyred master. The hero realized that Alfred's holy mission was a form of madness every bit as deep as the beastly scourge. The atmosphere was one of shattered, blood-splattered faith, as Alfred eventually took his own life, believing he had finally achieved the purity his order demanded. The hero was left with a lump of royal flesh, a reminder that even the most immortal of beings could be reduced to a macabre souvenir by the hand of a fanatic. The experience ends with the hero standing in the desolate, windswept throne room of Cainhurst, the queen's flesh held in their hand. The sovereignty of the Vilebloods had led to a basement of broken crowns. They carried the weight of the executioner's wheel and the memory of the ghostly ballroom. The atmosphere was one of empty, aristocratic silence, a realization that both the church and the nobility were dead branches of the same rotting tree. The focus would now shift to the altar of despair within the upper cathedral ward, as the protagonist prepared to resurrect the queen and confront the Eberietas, daughter of the cosmos, the great one whose blood was the true source of all this misery. The final legacy of Cainhurst is a story of the persistence of the forbidden. Even after the massacre and the madness, the blood remained. The hero realized that the Vilebloods were not a separate species, but a potential within the blood that the church could never truly kill. As the protagonist looked out from the battlements toward the distant, glowing spires of Iharnam, they understood that the history of the world was a spiral of blood and betrayal, where every act of holy cleansing only served to water the seeds of a new, darker harvest. The journey through the snow had provided a cold, clear perspective on the origins of the hunt, revealing that the gods of the church were just as fragile and desperate as the monsters of the castle. The ascent to the upper cathedral ward marks the transition from the public-facing religiosity of Iharnam to the insulated, eldritch heart of the healing church's highest authority, the choir. Accessible only with a key recovered from the depths of the unseen village, this area is a silent, moonlit sanctum perched high above the city, where the wind whistles through the spires of the orphanage. This experience is defined by the aesthetic of celestial isolation, as the protagonist steps into a realm where the air is thin and the light of the moon feels unnaturally close. The atmosphere shifted from the beastly rot of the lower streets to a chilling, cosmic claustrophobia. To walk the halls of the orphanage was to realize that the healing church was not just a medical institution or a priesthood, but a cradle for transhumanist horrors. The hero understood that the choir had surpassed Lawrence's original vision, moving away from the blood of beasts toward the stellar resonance of the great ones, transforming the children of Iharnam into living antennas for the voices of the stars. The exploration of the orphanage is a story of stolen innocence and blind ambition. The halls are prowled by brainsuckers creatures that represent the physical cost of the choir's obsession with insight. And the dark corridors are filled with the soft, wet sounds of their movements. This was the era of the orphanage harvest, where the atmosphere was one of clinical, theological despair. The hero discovered that the children taken by the church were not being cared for, but were being cultivated like crops to become the celestial emissaries. The atmosphere was oppressive and ghostly, a realization that the church's greatest successes were built on the mutilation of the young. The hero moved through the dark, encountering the small celestial adversaries, blue-skinned beings that looked like a cross between a child and a star creature. This part of the history is a story of the eradication of the human image, where the protagonist realized that the choir's ultimate goal was to abandon the flesh entirely and join the great ones in the cold vacuum of the cosmos. The confrontation with the celestial emissary was a moment of artificial divinity. In a hidden garden filled with glowing, blue-tipped flowers, the hero faced a being that was the crowned result of the choir's experiments. This was the falsified god, a towering, bulbous entity that could call down the light of the stars. The atmosphere was one of surreal, arcane chaos, as a swarm of smaller creatures attempted to protect their leader. The hero realized that the emissary was not a true great one, but a human soul stretched to the breaking point, a biological transmitter designed to communicate with the heavens. The victory over the emissary was a shattering of the glass ceiling, as the hero broke through the window of the grand balcony to reveal the church's most guarded secret, the altar of despair. This experience was the lifting of the final veil, exposing the divine engine that had fueled the city of Iharnam for generations. The descent to the altar of despair was a story of the abandoned daughter. Deep beneath the spires of the cathedral, in a cavern that seemed to exist outside of the city's geography, the hero encountered Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos. This was the living source of the old blood, a great one who had been left behind by her kin and was subsequently discovered and harnessed by the scholars of the choir. The atmosphere shifted to one of mournful, eldritch intimacy as the protagonist approached a creature that was a harrowing mosaic of tentacles, wings, and eyes. Ebrietas did not attack immediately. She sat before the altar, weeping for her lost family. The hero realized that the miracle of the blood was a parasitic relationship, where the church had been milking a grieving god to power their empire. The atmosphere was heavily, viscerally sad, a realization that the foundational god of the healing church was herself, a prisoner of human greed. The battle against Ebrietas was a moment of celestial collision. As the daughter of the cosmos unleashed her power, the air became thick with a call from beyond, a barrage of laser-like starfire that tore through the stone floor. This part of the history is a story of the wrath of the left behind. As the hero dodged the charging weight of the Great One and the lashing of her blood-spattered tentacles, the atmosphere was one of blinding, arcane violence. The hero, realizing they were fighting a piece of the infinite, trapped in a mortal frame. The hero had to execute the source, ending the supply of blood that had cursed Iharnam. The death of Ebrietas was a sovereignty of the void, as the Great One dissolved into the same starlight that she had once commanded. The hero was left in the ringing silence of the cavern, holding the Is chalice, a key to the deepest levels of the labyrinth, where the truth of the Great Ones first began. The interaction with the altar of despair itself provided a story of temporal resurrection. Upon the altar sat the petrified remains of a creature that resembled the Rome, the vacuous spider. The hero realized that this sight possessed the power to rewind the state of a living thing, a secret the church used to ensure their holy mediums never truly perished. By placing the queen's flesh from Canehurst upon the altar, the hero witnessed the reconstitution of the vile-blood queen, proving that the cycle of the blood could transcend even the total destruction of the body. The atmosphere was one of ancient, horrific potential, a realization that the gifts of the Great Ones were double-edged swords that could preserve a nightmare just as easily as they could heal a wound. The protagonist understood that they were now playing with the fabric of reality, using the tools of the choir to manipulate the very fates they had been sent to resolve. The experience ends with the hero standing at the edge of the upper cathedral ward, looking down at the burning spire of the city. The sovereignty of the choir had led to a cavern of divine grief. They carried the weight of Ebrietas's blood and the resurrected queen's gratitude. The atmosphere was one of cold, astronomical clarity, a realization that the healing church was never about the people of Iharnam, but about returning to the stars at any cost. The focus would now shift to the nightmare frontier and the amygdala, as the protagonist prepared to cross the bridge of the dream, to face the Great Ones who had watched the tragedy of the city with cavalier, multi-eyed indifference. The final legacy of the upper cathedral ward is a story of the hubris of the scholar. The choir believed they could contact the divine without paying the price of their humanity, but they ended up as brain-sucking husks in a dark hallway. The hero realized that the daughter of the cosmos was the most human entity in the entire cathedral, and her death was the final nail in the coffin of the church's legitimacy. As the protagonist looked out at the pale-blood moon hanging over the orphanage, they understood that the hunt was a mere distraction from the cosmic harvest that was taking place in the shadows of the stars. The journey through the heights had provided a stellar perspective on the madness of men, revealing that the voice of the gods was often just the sound of a dying mother calling out into an empty universe. The transition from the clinical towers of the upper cathedral ward to the jagged, alien ecology of the nightmare frontier marks a shift from the failures of man to the ancient, indifferent dominion of the Great Ones. This is a realm that exists outside the physical geography of Iharnam, a twisted landscape of weathered stone, poisonous swamps, and gravity-defying rock formations that seem to have been carved by the winds of the cosmos. To enter this place, the protagonist had to be gripped by the invisible hand of an amygdala, a moment of violent displacement that shattered the illusion of a world governed by human logic. The atmosphere shifted from the cold, moonlit spires of the city to a dust-choked, primordial twilight. To walk the nightmare frontier was to realize that the Great Ones were not just visitors to the human world, but the architects of a vast, multidimensional reality in which Iharnam was merely a flickering candle. The hero understood that this was the backyard of the gods, a place where the waste of the stars accumulated, and where the very earth was a manifestation of an incomprehensible divine mind. The exploration of the frontier is a story of evolutionary dead ends and cosmic predators. The landscape is populated by Loran clerics and silver beasts, creatures that suggest a history of shattered civilizations that fell long before Iharnam was even a thought. This was the era of the pre-human catastrophe, where the atmosphere was one of vast geological despair. The hero moved through the poisonous bogs, where the liquid was not water, but a dark, viscous residue of the Great One's influence. The atmosphere was hostile and uncanny as the protagonist encountered the winter lanterns, horrific entities made of brain tissue and tattered dresses that hummed a dissonant lullaby of frenzy. The hero realized that the frontier was a sifter of souls, a place where the weak were consumed by the sheer weight of the environment's eldritch radiation. This part of the history is a story of the insignificance of the individual, where the protagonist understood that the hunt was a local tragedy occurring within a much larger interstellar machine of consumption. The interaction with Patches, the spider, provided a moment of mortal treachery in a divine place. Patches, a figure who had survived the nightmare by serving the amygdala, represented the pitiable opportunism of those who sought favor with the gods. He led the hero to a cliff's edge, promising treasure before pushing them into the toxic depths below. This was the betrayal of the familiar, as the atmosphere became one of dirty, survivalist cruelty. The hero realized that even in a place as grand as the nightmare frontier, the petty vices of humanity remained. Patch's devotion to the amygdala was a parasitic faith, a belief that by serving a monster, he could avoid becoming its prey. The hero understood that the gods did not demand worship. They demanded compliance through terror. And Patches was the willing henchman of a power that didn't even know his name. This realization added a layer of sordid human filth to the cosmic majesty of the nightmare, proving that no matter how far one traveled into the stars, the base instincts of the self followed. The ascent toward the highest plateau of the frontier was a story of the multi-eyed watcher. Standing atop a bridge of stone, the hero faced the amygdala, a lesser great one that served as a guardian of the threshold. This was the anatomy of the nightmare, as the protagonist looked upon a creature with elongated, spindly limbs and a head covered in glistening, unblinking orbs. The amygdala did not fight with the heat of Lawrence or the grace of Maria. It fought with the bored, destructive curiosity of an entity that viewed the hero as an insect. The atmosphere shifted to one of blinding, psychic pressure as the creature used its long arms to rend the fabric of space itself. The hero realized that the amygdala was the physical manifestation of the veil, a being that existed in multiple places at once, watching the city of Iharnam from the shadows of every cathedral, while its true form resided here in the waste. The battle was a conflict of scales, as the mortal hunter attempted to wound the infinite with a blade made of mere metal. The battle against the amygdala was a moment of violent apotheosis. As the creature ripped off its own arms to use as clubs, the air became thick with a violent cosmic resonance. This part of the history is a story of the fragility of the divine form, as the hero learned that even a great one could bleed if struck with enough conviction. The atmosphere was one of crushing, tectonic violence, the very ground shaking beneath the weight of the gods' thrashing. The hero had to shatter the head of the watcher, ending the psychic grip that the amygdala held over the frontier. The death of the Great One was a collapse of the illusion, as the body dissolved into a stardust that smelled of old seawater. The hero was left in the empty, howling wind of the plateau, holding the ailing Loran chalice, a relic that pointed toward the ancient labyrinth, where the first contact with the blood had occurred. The discovery of the path to the ailing Loran was a story of the mirror of history. By examining the artifacts found in the amygdala's wake, the hero realized that the nightmare frontier was actually a post-apocalyptic vision of Loran, a land that had been swallowed by the sand and the scourge long ago. The atmosphere was one of cyclical doom, a realization that Iharnam was not special. It was simply the latest victim of the blood. The protagonist understood that the Great Ones did not care for kingdoms or kings. They were forces of nature that moved across the universe like a tide of evolution, leaving behind the wreckage of worlds in their wake. The hero carried the gloom of the fallen continent, realizing that the hunt was an inevitability of the human condition when faced with the indifference of the stars. The focus would now shift to the deepest levels of the Pithumerian labyrinth, as the protagonist prepared to descend into the womb of the world to face the ancient queen and find the final key to the nightmare. The experience ends with the hero standing at the edge of the frontier, looking back toward the melted spires of the nightmare city. The sovereignty of the amygdala had led to a plateau of cosmic dust. They carried the weight of the Loran chalice and the memory of the brain hymn. The atmosphere was one of total astronomical desolation, a realization that the universe was a graveyard of civilizations that had tried to touch the gods. The focus would now shift to the great Pithumeru Ihil chalice, as the protagonist prepared to walk the halls of the first city, where the old blood was first found, and where the Queen of the Deep still waits in her eternal, blood-slicked slumber. The hero understood that to truly end the nightmare, they had to go back to the very beginning, to the tomb of the gods, where the sovereignty of man was first surrendered to the void of the stars. The final legacy of the nightmare frontier is a story of the perspective of the void. The hero realized that the gods were not cruel, they were remote. The amygdala was not a monster, it was a filter. As the protagonist looked at the pale-blood sun setting over the horizon of the nightmare, they understood that the human soul was a foreign object in a cosmic machine. The journey through the waste had provided a geological clarity on the tragedy of Iharnam, revealing that the blood of the church was just a drop in an ocean of cosmic failure. The story of the nightmare frontier finds its final, desolate resolution in the silence of the dust, leaving behind a hunter who is no longer just a slayer of beasts, but a witness to the end of all things. The final descent into the deepest, lightless strata of the Pithumerian labyrinth marks the transition from the surface-level tragedies of Iharnam to the foundational horror of the human race. This is the great Pithumeru Ihil, a subterranean necropolis of white stone and obsidian that predates the very concept of history. To reach this place, the protagonist had to perform rituals of blood and bone, peeling back the layers of the earth to find the tomb of the gods, where the first contact with the Great Ones occurred. This experience is defined by the weight of eternal stagnation, as the hero steps into a silent, airless city that has been preserved in a state of gilded, cryptic decay. The atmosphere shifted from the chaotic, cosmic distortion of the nightmare to a stark, monochromatic majesty. To walk the halls of Ihil was to realize that the Pithumerians were not just ancestors, but the failed predecessors of the healing church, a civilization that once served as the humble guardians of the Great Ones before being consumed by the very blood they were meant to protect. The exploration of the Great Ihil is a story of ritualistic preservation and ancestral guilt. The corridors are patrolled by the Pithumerian descendants, ancient, emaciated warriors who move with a spasmodic, blinding speed, wielding curved blades that hum with the energy of the deep. This was the era of the sovereignty of the deep, where the atmosphere was one of vast, subterranean silence, broken only by the sound of heavy stone doors grinding open. The hero moved through the grand auditoriums of the labyrinth, realizing that the Pithumerians had built an entire society around the service of the divine womb. The atmosphere was oppressive and sacred, a realization that the old blood was not a discovery made by Lawrence, but a relic of a broken pact that had already destroyed one world. This part of the history is a story of the inevitability of the scourge, where the protagonist understood that the hunt was a biological imperative that had been repeating for eons beneath the surface of the earth. The encounter with the bloodletting beast within the heart of the labyrinth was a moment of physical archaeology. This towering monstrosity its head often missing or replaced by a writhing mass of parasites, represents the primal source of the beastly plague. This was the ancestor of the cleric beast, a creature whose blood was so potent that it could rewrite the DNA of a kingdom. With a single drop, the atmosphere shifted to one of raw, brutal anatomical terror. As the hero dodged the crushing weight of a beast that seemed to be made of living, pulsating muscle. The hero realized that the Pithumerians had tried to domesticate the corruption, using this creature as a source of their power, only to have it hollow out their civilization from the inside. The battle was a conflict of primal forces, as the mortal hunter attempted to sever the lineage of the scourge at its very root, realizing that the beast was not an external enemy, but a manifestation of the blood's own will to survive and spread. The approach to the final chamber of the labyrinth was a story of the mother of the nightmare. Standing before a set of massive, blood-slicked doors, the hero entered the sanctum of Iharnam, Pithumerian queen. This was the grave of the first miracle, as the protagonist faced the woman whose corrupted womb had birthed the history of the city that bore her name. The atmosphere was one of tragic, regal desolation, as the queen stood in her white, blood-stained wedding dress, her hands shackled and her stomach bearing the deep, brutal scars of a divine C-section. She did not fight with weapons, but with the blood itself, summoning sprays of crimson that crystallized into daggers and erupting in a telepathic scream that paralyzed the hero's mind. The hero realized that the queen was the original vessel, a woman who had been violated by the Great Ones to provide a bridge between the mortal and the divine. The battle against Queen Iharnam was a moment of cathartic deconstruction. As the queen vanished into a mist of blood and reappeared with clones of herself, the air became thick with a violent, maternal rage. This part of the history is a story of the end of the bloodline, as the hero realized that the queen's own blood was a lethal poison to those who did not share her lineage. The atmosphere was one of chilling, liturgical violence, the hero dodging the shadow of the unseen child, Murgo, who still seemed to linger in the queen's presence. The hero had to slay the source of the curse, ending the physical existence of the woman who had gifted the world its own destruction. The death of the queen was a release from the labyrinth, as she bowed her head in a final, graceful acceptance of her fate. The hero was left in the empty, white silence of the sanctum, holding the Iharnam stone, a calcified memory of a lost child that served as the final evidence of the Great One's parasitic love. The return to the surface after the defeat of the queen was a story of the completion of the circle. By standing in the graveyard of the hunter's dream with the Iharnam stone in hand, the hero realized that the hunt was finally, truly over. The atmosphere was one of absolute, exhausted clarity, a realization that the nightmare was not just a dream, but a historical necessity that had been resolved by the only hunter who was willing to look into the abyss and not blink. protagonist understood that they had purged the past of the Pithumerians and silenced the future of the healing church. The hero was now the sole architect of a new reality, a being that possessed the knowledge of the labyrinth and the power of the stars. The focus would now shift to the ascension to Great One status, as the protagonist prepared to lead humanity out of the dark, or simply watch the new world be born from the safety of the cosmos. The experience ends with the hero standing at the very top of the hunter's dream, the sun of a new age finally breaking over the horizon. The sovereignty of the Pithumerians had led to a foundation of white stone. They carried the weight of the Iharnam stone and the memory of the queen's tears. The atmosphere was one of infinite, ethereal peace, a realization that the long night was merely a necessary labor for the birth of something greater. The focus would now shift to the silence of the stars, as the hero, now an eldritch infant, rested in the arms of the doll, ready to begin the true history of the universe without the interference of the blood or the ambition of men. The journey through the deep had provided a geological finality on the tragedy of the world, revealing that the end of the hunt was just the beginning of the dream. The final legacy of the Bloodborne saga is a story of the cost of seeking the truth. To find the source of the plague, the hero had to destroy the source of life. The labyrinth remains as a shadow beneath the earth, a reminder of the civilizations that came before and the void that waits for those who seek the sun. The hero realized that the great ones were not gods to be worshipped, but forces to be surpassed. As the protagonist looked at the world below one last time, they understood that the blood was a vessel for memory, and by drinking the memory of the world, they had become its new master. The story of Iharnam finds its final, merciful resolution in the silence of the stars, leaving behind a universe that is finally empty and free, ready to be written by the hand of a new god.